So welcome to this episode of Menopause Conversations. My name is Amantha King. I'm an executive menopause coach and a workplace menopause consultant. And I absolutely love doing this series because I get to meet amazing people with amazing backgrounds, like the one and only Paula Rastrick. Hello, Paula. How are you?
Hello, Amantha. I'm good, thank you. Thanks for having me on.
Yeah, I was just really saying, always feel that Paula is a really important person to have as part of the menopause conversation, because I think she brings something totally unique to it. So I'm going to get you to introduce yourself, Paula, to tell people who you are, why you are in the space of menopause, and why you do what you do. So over to you.
Okay, yeah. I'm a psychotherapist and I specialise in trauma. So my speciality is trauma, particularly only in the niche of midlife mental health. So it's all around trauma and the connections to the brain and the body in kind of simplistic terms, and then the connection to menopause. And the reason I'm doing this is I've been involved in psychology for a long time. I originally worked in professional sports, so I've always worked with the brain and the body, but previously was more involved in pain science. So complex pain science, how the brain and the body interact once there's been an injury, how that affects performance. So slightly different. And then in 2017, I was diagnosed as perimenopausal. I was 45. And I was given very high doses of hormone replacement therapy. And unfortunately, at that point, that made me very, very unwell. And at that point, I had to close my business, lots of things going on, had lots of problems personally. And it was kind of from that 2017, that recovery, that I like to call it, recovering from being over medicated and the consequences of that I started to join dots. I started to look backwards at my life. I wanted to work out, why did I end up in such a bad way at 45, and why did I react so badly to the hormone replacement therapy? And that journey from then has led me to where I am now, which is really helping to educate more women around trauma, adverse childhood experiences, the effects that can have on your mental health, your physical health, and your hormones, because there's a biology and a psychology to trauma.
Love that. I honestly can't get enough of you. Whenever I'm got a few minutes to spare, I'm always like checking out your Instagram, because you're so informative and you speak with such passion. But more than that, because there's lots of people out there speaking with passion, you speak with that gravitas, which is rooted in knowledge and it's founded in evidence. And
yes, I'm very evidence-based, Amantha. I want to point that out. And also, I have the knowing of my own experience. I am that person. The people I'm talking to, I've been there. I've been to hell and back in some ways. So it's that combination, I think, of the knowing, but also I am very driven by research. So it's all evidence-based.
Absolutely. And I think that's what attracted me to your story. Can we just clarify a couple of things for people, because we want to make sure that people stay with us on the journey? When you say that you were given high doses of HRT, you and I know that that includes estrogen, progesterone, testosterone. So could you clarify, what were you given high doses of? All three, one or two?
So originally I was put on estrogen and with progesterone. So I was put on 100 patch of estrogen with progesterone, no testosterone. And then I went away and I started to feel very unwell. I went back and I said, I'm not feeling very well. I think, I'm having these awful side effects, and my mental health deteriorated. It was really quite concerning. At that point, I was then given testosterone to add in, and then I was doubled on my estrogen, and then the progesterone wasn't touched at all. So that's exactly what happened there.
So when we say high doses, I mean, there's been a lot of stuff, hasn't there, recently in the press and statements and various things around high doses. Yeah. Do we classify that as a high dose, or is that a high dose for you?
Well, I think that's, it's all relative, isn't it? So I was started on 100 patch, which would be the highest kind of licensed dose, if you like. So I've tried to find out why start me on that dose? What's the rationale for that? Because we've all got different brains and nervous systems, which is, part of my work. So when I went back and said I was having these awful side effects, I mean, my mental health was, I was just at that point where it wasn't great. It really wasn't great. That was then doubled. So if you double that, if you take it from 100 and double it up to 200, you're then talking twice the amount of licensed doses very quickly, aren't you? And then you're adding in testosterone. So I see people on social media saying, well, I'm on, I don't know, 200, but I don't absorb very well. I can categorically tell you there was no conversations about absorption. There was no blood test done about absorption. It was just, you're not feeling great, double the estrogen. And it was very much focused on get more estrogen into your body, into your system.
So I think this is a perfect time to talk about those, the tachyphylaxis, those supraphysiological levels of hormones circulating. Let's talk between us about what's happening then. So we know a statement that's come out recently from the British Menopause Society saying about, listen, this is what's the problem with having too higher doses. I mean, give your take on it, and if there's anything else to add in, I may add something in, but this is the problem, isn't it?
Well, it can be a problem, can't it? Because tachyphylaxis in itself is where you've just become kind of your body's adjusted to this dose, and you're kind of getting symptoms again. So you're re-experiencing symptoms that you thought you were getting help with, and then because then you think you're getting more menopause symptoms, you're being told to put more estrogen into the system, and that is, well, one, it's dangerous, and two, it doesn't actually make any sense. If something's, even if you were to look at the argument, which I hear a lot, of absorption, you wouldn't double or treble or triple whatever an amount of estrogen. You would change the route of delivery. You would not stick with that route of delivery. So there in itself is a big question mark about delivery, because if someone's saying to you, oh, that medication's, I mean, antidepressants would be a good example. If someone said to you, take antidepressants, and then you were started on a very high dose, imagine what's going on in your brain, and then you went back and you said, I'm having side effects from this this antidepressant, we'll double it. I mean, it just doesn't make sense. It's not working. It's full stop. Something's not working in the system, and it's very complex, the brain. So clearly there's an issue, and clearly at this point we should be saying, it's potentially the HRT that's causing the issue, not let's put more in the system.
And yes, and I'd like to counter that. I mean, my background before I ended up here was I'm actually, a biomedic, so biomedical science and stuff. And we've talked at length about this off air. There's more than one system taking place here. So I'd like to why not throw some other issues into this nice vat, which is that we know that estrogen starts messing around with histamine levels, and that in itself has 100 symptoms. So now how do you dissect all of that? Second of all, which the big thing that concerns me is what's happening to the estrobolome, which, by the way, is the microbiome in your gut that's responsible for getting that old estrogen out.
Yeah, where's it going? How are you?
Well, we know where it's going. It's been recirculated, and
exactly, and that's not good.
And that's not good, because if you have circulatory problems, which I do, I hold on to my estrogen. I'm a bit greedy with it, and I don't have to have much to hold on to it. And then, of course, my histamine levels. And I just told you, anecdotally, that I've had a terrible time in the last 5 weeks with my HRT, and that's because it's high pollen season, so there's a lot of circulating pollen, which causes increased histamine. But my gut and my liver are being absolutely hammered, and so I'm struggling. So we've got the whole physiological thing, and like we've said before, Paula, the human body is a complex series of systems. I mean, it's like the motorways around London, isn't it? You don't just have the M25, you've got the M1, the M11, everything's sort of converging and going round, isn't it? So how do we can't possibly dissect and go it's as simple as take more estrogen, because everyone is unique. And I mean, we could go on and on. It's why we need more research. That's why we need to actually have more facts around this. But we can't keep you know, the definition of madness is to keep doing the same thing over and over again and expect a different result. So I'm totally with you on it does not make clinical sense.
It doesn't make any sense. It doesn't make any biological sense. It doesn't make psychological sense. It doesn't make any sense. And this is the point that I am really trying to, I mean, my work is around the brain and the nervous system. So, you know, yes, I look at it from a lens of trauma, and I'm very particularly interested in these the sex hormones within the brain and the nervous system, you know, and the stuff that I know, what I'm seeing in terms of HRT prescribing doesn't make any sense. It really, not from a mental health perspective.
No. So let's put that to one side for a moment and let's talk about how can people understand the interplay between adverse childhood events and what's happening with their sex hormones. Can you talk to us a little bit from the beginning and take people on that journey of what constitutes an adverse childhood event?
Yeah, I mean, if we look at the ACEs, we'll say ACEs. If we look at the ACEs research, which is now huge, okay, so we now know from a biopsychosocial perspective, and again, menopause is a biopsychosocial experience. You've got so many multiple, you know, variables going into the pot, but one of them that we know, fact, is that adverse childhood experiences can play a significant role in future health in terms of your biology and your psychology, your mental health. So fact, that's well established. So we know that that's because of the toxic stress response, which I'll talk about in a second. My work, so there's all of that research over there. Now, what I've done then is I've decided to look at what happened to me and then look at my childhood and my trauma background, which I've avoided all of my life. And most of us, I think, of our age now, when we think if you've had any trauma, then you have probably suppressed it. You've probably tried to avoid it. You will have adapted many coping strategies that you probably don't realize, you know, keeping busy, constantly staying busy, don't want to feel that feeling, you know, we could go on. But what I've started to look at is the relationship between, particularly in menopause symptoms. So, you know, we like to talk about menopause symptoms, don't we? It takes up a lot of a conversation. So if we were to look at menopause symptoms and what's happening with a woman from a kind of, you know, a brain and a body perspective, if you take the research and then you apply it to menopause, we've got some research now, it's not a lot, but we've got some research that is suggesting it's a strong, significant association that women with a history of childhood adversity will have a biological response in menopause. They will have potentially a more heightened response to the psychological and the somatic symptoms, we'll call them, in the menopause transition. So there's a link, there's a bridge.
So what is somatic, so that people can understand what is somatic?
So you would talk about your physical symptoms being somatic, you know, so you could be thinking about hot flashes, you could be thinking about, you know, sleep, there's urogenital symptoms. I mean, you know, vaginal dryness, UTIs, all of these, and then you've got what I call your psychological and cognitive symptoms, emotional symptoms, all of this stuff is all, there's a link for women that I think is missing, that piece of the jigsaw that we're not talking about. We're not trauma informed.
No, and I would like to sort of pick up on that in that when I coach women, you know, the first thing we do is we talk about their history, like from forever.
From birth onwards.
From birth onwards.
Yeah. Your periods, your hormonal.
Yes, what your mum's periods were like. What
I had my mum in the womb. You know, it sounds all a bit, but you know, I had postnatal depression. Oh, okay. So you start to, you know, that's what I say to women. I say your history, your story is imprinted into your nervous system from the womb. So instead of it just being, let's look at menopause here, you need to widen that lens and as an individual understand yourself. You know, what's the body telling me? Because all symptoms are messages from the body. That's it, right?
Exactly.
And so you need to understand, and we don't all have the same symptoms, and you know, and there seems to be I do have a bugbear about some of the symptom list. I'm like, well, who's making up these symptoms? Who's putting these symptoms on a list? You know, some of them are quite, they're so, in fact, pretty much all of the symptoms of menopause, because I've cross-checked all of them, 34 I've looked at, could be trauma responses, could be nervous system dysregulation, could be thyroid problems, could be gut problems, could be, again, it's going to go back to what's the biggest common denominator for you as an individual, and perhaps start to take that piece of the jigsaw first and work from there, rather than it's just these hormones, because they're not acting in isolation.
No, and that is so true. And you know, coming back to, I saw a wonderful description the other day, and I do want to research it a bit more, but it was like, actually, you and I will have spent 6 months inside of our grandmothers.
Okay.
So we as eggs would have been inside our grandmothers for 6 months. You cannot say that you weren't epigenetically affected by trauma and passed down through your bloodline.
All of that stuff. So intergenerational trauma, which we now know is, you know, the research behind all of this is, it's fascinatingly, you know, I mean, I'm absolutely fascinated with it. But to give you an example of my mum was very poorly when she was pregnant. I had no attachment bond to my mum when I was born, and that stayed throughout my life. But my mum was in a relationship with my dad, who was an alcoholic, and he beat her. So can you imagine, firstborn me, what's going on in utero, what's going on in the womb, how much is being passed through that stress response through to me as a child, a baby that's not even been born yet. I mean, you can start from there, and I've got goosebumps, because that is so relevant.
And this is it. So these are the conversations that certainly I have with people. Like, we talk about their timeline, and they go, "My what?" And it's like, no, let's be open to exploring what's gone on in your timeline that you just didn't get the memo on. I know that's very old-fashioned because they don't write memos anymore, but if only they did. You know, email, you didn't get the email on that. And so the reality is, you're so right. Our body is reacting, and we've got those maladaptive responses that keep us safe, keep us secure, keep the threat level low.
You know, it keeps us disconnected, because I reckon most women, not all, have stayed up in their heads. Like, it's like disconnect from the body, because you don't want to, it's the feelings. We know from trauma responses that the trauma is stored in somatic memory, and it's held in the body. It's not held in the mind. And we spend most of our time like disconnected. And then when you get to menopause, it's like when the hormones start to become unstable again, through hormonal you know, reproductive stages, it opens another window of vulnerability. That's the only way. It's like it's a window of vulnerability, which is why when you look back and think postnatal depression, oh, okay, periods, you know, PMDD to a certain extent, you know, you've got all of these little, there will be markers along the way. Like you've just said, your timeline, you know, I know it's painful, but that's the growth opportunity of menopause.
For sure. And that's why there is some light at the end of the tunnel. I think what we just don't need is an unhelpful narrative around it's all about your hormones. No, it's all about the things that are affecting you that ultimately then affect your hormones. So it's about that introspection,
internally and externally. Remember,
yes.
your hormones are interacting with the environment. So if you're in a highly stressful environment, your hormones are interacting with your environment. And I think people potentially, I'm not saying all, seem to think that it's kind of internal all the time. Well, it's not. Your hormones react to your environment through your sensory processing. So if you've had a trauma background, you know, your cortisol, your stress hormones, if you've had a toxic stress response from childhood, your system's dysregulated, you are going to have had that through your life. You've not probably realized that. And then of course, when those hormones fluctuate in perimenopause, you start to have more vulnerability, because the hormones are interacting with neuroreceptors. You know, some of the stuff that I see, I think, well, I appreciate it's very complex, and it's very complex, the biology of trauma and the biology of menopause. But that's the point I'm trying to make. It's very complex. So we can't be so reductionist that we're just reducing it down to, you know, estrogen, testosterone, which is the new kind of thing. And then almost we never talk about progesterone, which I find really weird, because progesterone and estrogen play major roles in cognition, emotion, memory, learning. Both of those hormones are key, not just estrogen.
No, and so I really feel that, and I feel like I desperately want to get a flag and wave a flag for progesterone, because
So do I.
Yeah, let's get one. Let's get two made. Yeah,
Or
like
progesterone. It's like it just doesn't get talked about. And I mean, it's so important. And then I see a lot of bad press about it. So people will say, "Oh no, I've got a reaction and I'm progesterone intolerant." I think there's a real education thing as well about what's progesterone versus what's synthetic progestins as well, because
yes.
you know, people think progesterone and they go, "Oh yeah, no, it's the coil and I've got the," well, that's localized progestin and it's not the same as what would be happening in your brain. And I think there's a big gap.
I think there's a real re-education. I mean, I went through a period when I was perimenopausal where I just thought I had every illness going, because I was told you're a hypochondriac. And so I think I started to believe that message. And I remember having a camera put down, and I did it without any anaesthetic because I was desperate to get back to my daughter, who was only 4.
Oh, you're brave.
Yeah, I really was. I really dug deep because I just needed to be back there, because that was another level of anxiety and insecurity. Like, I can't be medicated. I'm not going to get back in time. But I remember so clearly, and bearing in mind I grew up in the pharmaceutical industry and around medics, and I remember sitting opposite a gastroenterologist, and he went, "Okay, so we didn't find anything. And what I need you to understand is irritable bowel syndrome doesn't exist, and it's actually a manifestation of everything that's going on in your head." And I went like that. I was like, "Sorry, is that my diagnosis?" And actually, he's right, because the reality was, you know, how do we know that it's progesterone that's problematic? How do I know that it's not that I was stressed 2 weeks ago and I'm still reeling from the residual effects of that, which is why the sphincter on the top of my muscle is very twitchy, or the sphincter on the bottom is not twitchy enough, type thing. You know, the reality is we're very, very quick to land on, it looks like, it sounds like, oh yeah, it's HRT that needs tinkering around with. It's like, no, just wait. Talk to me, ask me a few more deep-seated questions, and I'll be able to tell you that as a child I was chronically constipated. As a child I really struggled.
You will find those links.
Yeah,
you will find those links. And we know from research, and you know, this is undeniable, that your childhood will shape who you are as a person, from your behavior, everything, your behaviors, psychology, your habits, the way you interact with, and your relationships, and your biology, and your, so you know, really you should be starting back from the beginning of your life to work out, when you get to this junction, right, join the dots. That's what I did. And I know that's not easy, and that's what I do for other women, but that's what I did. I systematically, and then I thought, shit, you know, you can't, those emotions that you've been pushing down all of your life because you don't want to go there, you're gonna have, if I'm gonna move forwards with my life, then I'm going to need to do that, right? Because we know from research that inflammation in the body causes multiple health conditions. So you could be talking about your gut, your, you know, IBS, autoimmune, all of these things, you know. And as we get past or into menopause, we know that our sex hormones are doing jobs to kind of modulate the brain and protect the brain. And so therefore we need to look at it from a, right, what's my inflammation? And stress is inflammation. Stress is inflammation. Definitely. To the system, 100%. And when, you know, I don't want to go off on a tangent, but when we talk about Alzheimer's, and we talk about all the inflammation, the biggest markers is like something like cognitive debt. You know, how much stress have you got surging through your body? How much cortisol have you got?
Well, this is my favorite stat. It takes 3 days for a molecule of cortisol to leave your body. And I often liken it to, you know, when you go on those arcade machines where it's a ping ball and it shoots off and it bounces round. I leave that thought with people, say that's what cortisol is doing in your body. Really? It is wreaking havoc. And if you are chronically, like, levels of cortisol off the chart, you're not making your own sex hormones. You're only making cortisol, and you're just chronically inflamed.
You're in heat. So I describe it as being, it's that you push the system up. So when we talk about anxiety, and we talk about, you know, high levels of anxiety and feeling that's that hypervigilance, hyper awareness, hyper arousal, and you have what you call, probably what I call the home state. If you really look at yourself and you were to be honest, you know, I would have been that hyper type of person, you know, always busy, always keeping on the move, always trying to do that, you know. And there's only so long. I mean, that's what happened to me at perimenopause when I was over medicated. I was so in heat, high, that when I got over medicated, I crashed and I went into that freeze response, which is depression, which is flat, immobile. Because if your brain is constantly being pumped full of stress hormones, there's some point it will say, at some point, and it could be perimenopause, where it says, I'm going to have to stop you because I need to conserve energy, because this is a protection strategy as well. The brain will want to survive, because the brain really only cares about survival. That's it. The brain is there to survive. Your sex hormones are there to reproduce. So you can see that we've got this kind of mismatch of like, and they're both speaking to each other. So the HPA axis, your stress response, is interlinked with, you know, your thyroid, but even your gonadal hormones. So anything that's going on in this system, if that's pushing that system down, you're in trouble, aren't you? And no amount of HRT, and this is what I'm trying to say, is people have come to me and they're going, my mental health's got worse since I started taking estrogen. Yeah, well, we can answer that, right? Instead of just keep taking more, if you're taking super physiological doses of hormones and you don't understand the brain and the nervous system, you're taking in more than your body and your brain would have been producing anyway. That's not right. And estrogen is a excitatory hormone. Progesterone is the inhibitor. So if we just even talk about that, you know, if you're already in hypervigilance, if you already got a stress response, if you've had childhood trauma and someone says, here, take more estrogen, where are you going? Up. You are going up. And then they don't oppose the progesterone. You're getting pushed up. That anxiety is going to, that's what happened to me. And then add in testosterone. And all of a sudden I'm violent. My rage. Come on. It's quite obvious when you understand it. But why are we're not talking about it enough? I'm sorry. That's how I feel about this, knowing how it works in the brain.
And I think, though, it's not just around menopause. I mean, having worked in the NHS, we have scant to know, putting the patient in the middle and everything else wrapping around. We'll have a set of symptoms, and each specialism will pick off a symptom that they tinker around with, and they put you back in the system and let someone else have a go at you, type thing, as opposed to it's just not joined up, is it? So that's really, really clear. So we know these adverse childhood experiences. We know that actually the more we can delve into that ourselves, the better. So let's talk about how we can help people with that. Obviously, they can come and see you, but actually what mechanism? So how does a person, first of all, establish where they are with their, with childhood trauma? You know, do I have any? Don't I? I mean, what can we do to support people in that?
I think there's you know, women of our age, I'm going to kind of brushstroke this a little bit, but women of our age, I think there's still a lot of misinformation about what actually trauma is, for a start. Okay, because it's almost like, you know, I didn't have trauma. Oh, that's how it was in the 70s. You know, I would suggest the first thing is on my website, www.thebrainbodymethod.com. Sorry, not the Brain Body Method, it's brainbodymethod.com. I've got the ACEs research. I've got the test. So there's 10 questions that you answer based on your childhood. And then when they answer those questions, I've linked it to the current research around menopause symptoms. So that's the first stage, isn't it? Is understanding, okay, could there be a connection? Is my nervous system dysregulated? You know, have I lived a lot of my life in a dysregulated nervous system state? Because whatever's happening in your nervous system is happening with your hormones. So do you know what I mean?
Yeah.
And it's like, that nervous system is like the central spine and all these dynamic systems are related to the nervous system, aren't they? That's my work. So the gut, the heart, everything's connected. So the first thing I would do is become a little bit at least aware, because awareness is the first stage of change, isn't it? Of knowing. So I would do my ACEs score, then I would understand, okay, what's the science, what's the research? When you know that, and you know there's a potential link to your mental health, your psychology, and your menopause symptoms. I mean, I did a workshop last night, which was purely around the biology of menopause and trauma. I'm doing another workshop in October, which is about the nervous system. And then I'm doing another workshop in January, which is about the vagus nerve and how the vagus nerve, and there's estrogen receptors in the vagus nerve. So connecting all of that and understanding it, my first thing is always to people is just try to understand, have a bit of awareness. Now, I want to do, I think, more around group psychoeducation, because I can do that because there's common features, you know, within women. So that's something that I'm writing a book as well. So something that I'm going to look to offer. One-to-one work I do. I mean, I am pretty busy, but one-to-one trauma therapy. But the one thing I've just did exactly the same as you is when you're doing trauma therapy, I only work with midlife women. I do their hormonal profile as well. So, you know, at what age were the trauma or traumas? Because that will give you an indication of what your hormonal profile is at that age. You know, that timeline, what happened when you had your periods? You know, what kind of experience did you have with periods? What about did you have children? What was did you have postnatal depression? You know, it's charting the woman in her reproductive, you know, in her history of sex hormones, and then understanding the relationship to hormones anyway in the brain, and then looking at it from a trauma perspective. So I work with the body and the brain. So I work with somatic therapy, so safety in the body. And then once I achieve that, or we achieve that, sorry, I look to the specific therapy I do is called internal family systems. It's just absolutely brilliant. It's about those parts of you that protect you, the parts of you, the exiles, and then the little parts that have been protected. And see, when you understand all this stuff, even that in itself, that's what I did, game changer, because you take back control of those parts instead of thinking that there's something wrong with you. I'm very much around, I'm very against pathologizing mental health, because I truly believe, for some people, don't get me wrong, I think medication, absolutely, but if you were to look at it from a trauma-informed lens, a lot of what people have and feel is coming from childhood.
I totally agree. It's so refreshing to hear someone who speaks your language. Do you know what I mean? So I know that you do.
Science, Samantha.
And it is. It's not just opinion, and that's the thing that drives me mad. I mean, it's quite similar in NLP. We talk about parts integration. So we talk about the parts that are in conflict with one another, the mixed messages the parts are receiving or giving, and maybe that lack of realization that some of the parts want exactly the same thing, but they're protecting you. They're not listening to each other.
Might be a maladaptive, you know, and even when we talk about alcohol, we talk about drugs, these are coping strategies. You know, I come from a family of alcoholics. I have a lot of experience with addiction. Okay, I've been addicted to a few things in my life. So, but when you look at those parts, why did you become, you know, it's a coping mechanism. It's a way of coping. It's a way of blocking out and not having to deal with perhaps pain, and it comes from childhood.
Yeah. And the thing is, we're too close to it as well, aren't we? You know, if you only know what you know, and that's the limiting thing here. So, you know, if you've got that perfectionism, if you've got that be perfect script running, that good girl script, you know, I definitely have had that most of my life. It's only when you know where that's coming from that you go, hang on a minute, what you're telling me, I've actually got a choice, that I could do it differently if I had the knowledge and the wherewithal and the support. So I mean, it's fascinating. I mean, I just talk to you for hours. Well, we do talk quite a lot anyway, but
and then I always go over. I'm learning to try to.
I know there's always a second episode. There's always a second episode. So what I've taken so far, if we just summarize for people, that actually in that last little bit there, that actually if you can understand on some level, doing that inventory of yourself, so the 10 questions on Paula's website, thebrainbodymethod.com, which is all based on childhood, be aware of your score, understand the science that supports that score, linking it to the symptoms you might be experiencing, and actually then what is your history with your own sex hormones, how has that interplayed? So journaling that, reframing the narrative possibly you've been carrying around about yourself, that could be really helpful. And then what can people do? What would be
Say that again, sorry.
So what would be the next thing? So let's couple it then that someone's also perimenopausal, because that's probably who we're talking to right now en masse, are the people who probably be thinking, oh, okay, and these symptoms that I've been having. So what you're saying to me, it could be the origins are from somewhere else. What should we be advocating? We definitely aren't going go straight on HRT. What are we advocating or supporting people here with this next bit?
So I think the part of that is then learning about, if you understand what hormones and what's happening more in your body, then you can look to create your own your own way of lifestyle. And I don't mean that in a, people, I get a bit of pushback on lifestyle stuff, but say, for example, if you're not sleeping and you start to look at progesterone or magnesium, start to look at the bits that aren't, there's so many things that we can do without taking hormone replacement therapy. And I truly believe that when you actually understand the symptoms, because we've all got symptoms, take the symptoms and then work out why you've got the symptoms, because there's a reason you've got those symptoms, isn't there? It could be that you have a gut issue. If that was if you were saying to me, my gut's really bad, my digestion's really bad, we would be looking at that first, and then we would be saying, right, what's the key area we want to look at? Because I can tell you now, if you help regulate your gut is going to have a knock-on effect to your heart and your HRV. I do what's called, so the way I do it, I look at what's called stress tolerance. So I'm a big fan of not stress reduction. Now, it sounds a bit weird when I say it. Everyone's got a window of tolerance, okay? And when you have high levels of stress, your window of tolerance is very small, right? So there's an argument. The way I look at it is that we want to create a bigger window of tolerance, because we do live in the real world and we do have stresses.
Yes, so we can't avoid it.
You can't avoid stress, and I think that's when people say, you get a bit of pushback if you say, look, you need to meditate or do right. When you look at heart rate variability, so I'm very sciencey. So when I worked in professional football, right, what would we do? We would monitor heart rate variability, and if they were in the red zone, we'd pull them back and say, you're going to trip over into a stress response, so therefore we're going to down regulate that stress response before you, and then you can play Thursday against Man City. Do you see what I'm saying? Because
oh my god, I love it. Can I say, so this is so cool, because I actually said this to somebody yesterday. Someone said to me, so I started the whole HRT thing, Amantha, I still can't get rid of that thing around the middle, and I'm doing HIIT workouts, and I went, whoa,
you're pushing up your cortisol.
Let's back that truck up quickly, because that's taking you into cortisol production mode. So and I found that myself, again, through science, through research. During lockdown, I was doing sometimes 2 HIIT workouts a day, and then I was like, this is ridiculous, let's go back to science. What is this telling me? And what it was telling me was I was nudging too far over that. So my ideal optimal heart rate for exercise and well-being is 127 beats a minute. If I stay around that, happy days, I'm calm, I'm exercising, I'm feeling good. And so what we know is it's these messages, we're getting these messages en masse that aren't catered enough for the uniqueness of who people are. So you're absolutely right.
To individualize it. Yeah, you don't want to go mad in terms of getting obsessed with data as well, but so heart rate variability is a really good way of measuring. So you can do that yourself. I've got like a little monitor, heart rate. So I'll just do twice a day, put my heart into sync with my body, and then it will give you that you've got into that zone. And all you're doing then is you're helping to increase that window of tolerance. So you've got more tolerance to stress. But if you don't know the data and you don't understand that, most of us are spending our times up in high levels of stress. Now, I already know from pain science, because that's my background when I worked in football. If you're in high levels of stress, say you've had, a lot going on, and then you go out and perform you are at higher risk of injury, because the brain will try to protect. It's all about the brain. So again, it's really taking it from your brain and your nervous system. Your brain is always going to protect you. That's it. That's all the brain is interested in: survival. That is it.
And I heard something fascinating. I don't know if you heard this, and it just absolutely landed enormously with me, in that when we are in stress mode, our body floods our whole system with inflammatory markers in case we get wounded.
Yeah, there's so much science behind.
So the clotting, the higher risk of clotting, all of these things, the whole cardiovascular disease, it's like, I'm going to get bitten by a dinosaur. That's what our body's thinking, or a tiger or something.
It's just there to survive. Your brain is primarily, it's a hormone sensitive organ, the brain, but it's actually, its biggest, strongest output is protection. That's it. So you're either in protection mode, or you're in what's called connection. So that's when you're regulated, you've got oxytocin, you've got, and this is why attachment, I mean, I could go on all day, but this is why attachment from birth is really important, because it buffers that toxic stress response. So say I had trauma, I had sexual abuse when I was younger, but I never had any attachment with my mum. My mum and she didn't buffer that traumatic event for me, because we didn't have an attachment. So that trauma was made more traumatic because I didn't have a relationship with my mum. It's all around the nervous system. The science
it
is amazing.
I'm smiling because I currently I listen to loads of books in the car, but I'm currently listening to Eckhart Tolle's book, which is How to Keep Your Children Close. And I've got a teenager, and it goes into great detail about the various levels of attachment theory and how this shows up in our health later in life. So you're absolutely, so that is fascinating.
And it's biology, we're not talking woo here, we're talking absolute, the biology and psychology of trauma, and how that implicates into your health mentally and physically, and that is from birth. And so and menopause symptoms will have a direct relationship between the HPA axis and your HPG axis, and they are talking to each other. And that's what I think, if you understand more about that, then you're in a much more empowered place to say, well, what do I need to put into place for me? What's going to work in my life? Because that's another thing, saying to people, well, you should do this or you should do that. It's got to work for the person in their life, hasn't it? Realistic solutions that it's not a one size fits all. So if that person loves meditation, that's great, but so many people they don't want to sit in meditation because it's like, well, my brain's too busy. And then I would suggest you look at your heart rate variability and get your stress response, because those types of people, athletes, all of that, are much more wired to go, oh, I like that data, that's informing me of something. So if again, it's up to the person what works for them, isn't it?
It is. And I'm going to say something totally controversial now, which I wasn't expecting myself to say, but I know I've interviewed Dr. Anis Mukherjee, and I think something around how I believe people who can't take HRT have got it right. And what I mean by that is they are almost forced to consider the things that we've just spoken about, because there isn't an option for taking HRT if you have a history of cancer, or you're currently going through treatment, or you have a estrogen receptive type of cancer. I think they naturally are more in the mindset of, what else can I do?
Yeah, almost more of the mindset of saying, right, how am I going to do this? What do I need to do? They're more asking, they're more curious, and they're doing more inquiry. They're doing more self-inquiry.
And I think
it being fix this. And then I'm going to say something. I can tell you now, you cannot stick an HRT patch over trauma. That's one of my, and if you look at the research, even with confounding variables, which one of them was HRT, women who took HRT, if you have a trauma history, HRT made no difference.
Yes. And that is really powerful. And there is a lot more data coming out on that, isn't there? It's like it's just not the solution.
It's not, and for some people it is, and that's fine. And you know, and it's not to say no or yes, it's really trying to take it away from this. It's become so, this end of, like, you know, the spectrum, it's become so much more, the conversation in menopause has become either, do you take HRT? And that's it. There's, you know, it's like, oh my God, is that all we're going to offer each other? That, you know, that conversation is, are you on HRT? Yes, no. And then that's it. And it's like, well, women, come on, let's move away from that. You know, who are you as a person? What do you want to do with your life? Where are you going? What, you know, I just find it frustrating that it's just been narrowed down into this very narrow lens of, are you on HRT? Yeah, do you know what?
It's very reductive, isn't it? And it's it's unhelpful. And if that's all it comes down to is that soundbite, then we've really missed the point. So if we bring that full circle, because we're both very passionate about this topic, and other people are as well, but I do think it quashes people's confidence to step forward and say, I'm not happy. You know, I think a lot of people feel they've been missold something. It's a bit like mortgages and things like that. I think for a lot of people, the whole narrative around HRT can make people feel they've been missold.
They individually think they failed in some of these. I'm telling you, there's so many more women I'm seeing on social media going, HRT's not working for me. Okay, well, that could be because of multiple different things that you need to explore, right? It just isn't going to work for everyone.
No, and you know, it's more than, and it's like I always loved that whole phrase. I think it was Dr. Sarah Ball, no, in fact it was Dr. Zoe Hodson who said that, you know, menopause is like a three-legged milking stool. You can't talk about one hormone without talking about the others. But I would go even further than that. It's about lots of milking stools with lots of different hormonal systems
for each woman
that we know very little about, probably. So what's your hope, Paula? I mean, I know we've sort of like really mashed it all up and then put it back on the table, but what would be your hope for women navigating menopause? Let's say in 5 years' time, what would you hope for?
I would hope by that time that menopause has become trauma informed, so that we understand, so that, you know, if you think about it, your mum, my parents didn't know anything about the effects of trauma. They didn't know, right?
No.
We are the generation now that's kind of starting to understand it. So if we then start to talk about it more, we start to bring it up, how many, you know, how much good would that do in the world? I know that's big, but it's a big,
massive. I think it would change family. Can you imagine? Well, come back to that comment I made earlier about epigenetics. The eggs that our daughters are carrying, and their daughters will carry, we will be in a much better shape. That actually makes me feel very emotional. Actually,
same with me. I'm just
keeping it together.
I'm keeping it together. Keep my shit together. But this is what I'm saying. It's so important, and it's so, you know, menopause is not trauma informed. It's just not even, it's not even a conversation. I can't believe it. You know, so that's what my mission is to change that in menopause. I won't be able to change the world, but I can change it in menopause.
Well, I'd like you to do that. And then when you've done that, I would like you to make the whole NHS trauma informed, because I think it is a much bigger thing. So I know you're the woman for the job, because you are Mrs. Paula Rastrick, and that in itself is hugely powerful. I said to Paula when she came on, I said, I don't know anyone else whose tagline is Mrs. other than Mrs. Thatcher, and whatever you think about her, I mean, the Iron Lady. I think you are the Iron Lady of menopause, Mrs. Paula Rastrick.
I could be. I'm very passionate, and I'm a softie really, but I just don't like people being misinformed. It's one of my, I think there's so much misinformation out there that needs to be counteracted with, you know, with proper, you know, science and evidence-based help for women.
I agree. I don't think we're going to get all of that on a banner, but I'm going to make some inquiries about getting us one each. But for now, Paula, I mean, it's been so lovely to speak to you, and I definitely want to speak to you again. But how can we get, I know people will want to be in touch with you, if not to just ask where your beautiful wallpaper has come from. I'm sure they'll want to ask you so much more. But how can people be in touch with you and to follow you and to learn about you?
So I'm just starting out on LinkedIn. So you'll find me under Mrs. Paula Rastrick on LinkedIn. I'm going to be populating a little bit more over there, popping over to LinkedIn, as they say. I'm Instagram, Mrs. Paula Rastrick. TikTok, I'm on Mrs. Paula Rastrick. I don't do too much of that. But my main focus is going to be trying to get over to LinkedIn, really. And if you want to message me, I'm very good. And I don't mean it, I mean this in a humble way, but I'm very good at getting back to people. And I do voice notes. Everyone's like, oh my God, you got back to me. Well, yes, I'm going to get back to you because you've asked me a question and I'm going to help you. And that's it. That's how I see it, you know, and I direct to other people and I say, go look at Amantha because she knows loads about histamine and that's not my bag. And, you know, and I think even that signposting to people to other people, you know, I'm really, you know, my thing is about trauma and any questions I'm happy to take. And I really mean this. If you message me, I'll get back to you. It might take me a couple of days because if I'm really busy, but I always get back to people and I'll help you, you know, because really it's just, that's who I am. I'm just, you know, so passionate about women knowing about trauma because I come from that background. So it's my thing.
Speaks volumes. It speaks volumes, and I absolutely love that, and I can feel that connection. And not that she needs vouching for, but I totally vouch for that, and we do have really, really great conversations. So whatever I can do to help support you on LinkedIn, I'd be more than happy to do that, because I think we need more of Paula Rastrick. So for now, Paula, thank you so much for your time, and we'll send people over to your website and hopefully people will be in touch with you.
Thank you. Thanks, Samantha.
Thanks.